The Dedication is the 4th episode of the 2nd season of Frasier. This is directed by the wonderful James Burrows, and as always there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. And I think this is a pretty decent episode. It's definitely not my favourite. I think I only laughed out loud 2 times maybe, and that doesn't mean I didn't enjoy it. It just means compared to some others, I maybe don't rate it as highly, but it's still pretty decent. And there are 2 parts to the narrative, and the first one is established when Eve comes over because Frasier is driving her to Adam's dedication, and Freddy is also going to the ceremony, and Freddy makes a remark that he looks like he's in the chorus of HMS Pinafore, and this is the first time I laughed out loud, because Frasier, hearing HMS Pinafore, runs to the piano, and Freddy tells him, "Dad, get away from the piano." We're then at the ceremony, and Freddy gives this speech, and afterwards Frasier sees him talking to somebody, and it turns out that this is Dr. Stathos, played by Amy Sedaris, and she often helps the firefighters with, well, obviously various things, because it's a very intense job that's going to have a real strain on mental health. She's there to help people when times get particularly rough, and Frasier, finding out that Freddy is receiving therapy, partly is glad that his son is going to therapy, because obviously Frasier as a psychiatrist sees the benefit in that, but he's also upset that Freddy wouldn't talk to him. And I will say I feel like that's an unreasonable thing to think of, because I feel like it would be much easier to talk openly and honestly with a therapist than it is to talk to parents. I'm saying this as somebody who's had various types of therapy. It just seems easier to tell strangers your problems than it does your own family. Whether that's right or wrong, I do think that that's the case. And I'm surprised Frasier didn't immediately understand that. Maybe this was driven by his emotions rather than by logic. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. We're then in Eve's apartment, and David comes over to play this video game that Adam used to play. Freddy comes over to help her sort through the last box of Adam's things, and that's obviously going to be a really difficult thing to deal with, and it gets a little emotional, but not too much. They still manage to keep it quite light, and again, we'll come back to that in due course. Frasier then goes to see Dr. Stathos, and he does something that is quite interesting, because it's not the first time we've seen Frasier maybe breach ethics, but last night I started reading Kelsey Grammer's memoir. I think it was released in 1995, 96, maybe a little bit after that, but mid-Frasier anyway. And in the opening chapter, he explains how Frasier, who apparently was called Frasier Nye initially, not Frasier Crane, which I didn't know, but they wanted Frasier to date Diane while she was receiving therapy from him. And that's not quite what happens, but Kelsey Grammer points out in the memoir that he said, "I don't think this is what Frasier would do, because Frasier is very ethical and he wouldn't do this." And it's just a bit of a coincidence that I read that last night, and then here we have, that's obviously the very first encounter Kelsey Grammer had with Frasier, and now we have the latest, and he is breaching those ethics by stealing Freddy's file from Dr. Stathos' office. So I just thought that was really interesting. And also, if you didn't know, he was apparently called Frasier Nye to begin with. Nye as in N-Y-E. And he takes the file under his clothing to Mahoney's, where Olivia and Alan are. And they're coming up with some hypothetical situations for where it might be okay to open the file. And interestingly, Alan is the one who is certain that Frasier shouldn't do this. And my reading of this is he's definitely certain of this because of something we learned in the previous episode. In the previous episode, where, this is a spoiler for the previous episode, but at the end of the previous episode, we learned that actually Alan has a strained relationship with his daughter, and I think in this moment in Mahoney's, he was telling Frasier, "Don't do this because you will lose any trust that Freddy has in you." And I think that's Alan kind of saying, your son trusts you. You have this relationship with your son. Don't take it for granted and don't ruin it because he doesn't have that with his daughter. That's my reading of why he was so adamant anyway. He certainly told Frasier it was because of trust, but I think it's because of his own lack of relationship with his daughter. And Frasier decides, this is correct, I'll get it back before anybody knows it's missing. And before we progress with that, we're back with Eve and Freddy. David's in the background playing the video game, and Freddy comes up with a method of trying to know what to keep and what to get rid of. And I think this is pretty logical. I've never been in this situation, but I imagine it would be really helpful. He said they should keep the things that tell a story about Adam, but if it's something of Adam's that has no connection to anything, they shouldn't keep it. One example is there was a rock in his box of stuff, and Eve didn't even know why there was a rock, so it didn't make any sense to keep it. And then they had a t-shirt that did actually have a story attached to it, and I thought that was a pretty sensible way of approaching things. And I think if anybody else is going through something similar, it could be helpful. And I think that that's not unique to this episode. I think a lot of Frasier episodes do have really helpful messages or approaches to things that people watching may find beneficial if they can relate. And I imagine that that would be the case there. We're then in Dr. Stathos' office, and it was okay to begin with, but by the end of this scene, my hand was in front of my mouth at one point when something happened. It was genuinely shocking and took me by surprise, and I will of course mention what that moment is. But they go in the office, Alan and Frasier, and they hear Dr. Stathos coming, and Alan hides under the desk, and Frasier does a pose, and when Dr. Stathos comes in, she's very excited. She was a big fan of Frasier's. So when Frasier says he dropped by to give her some show memorabilia, she was very ecstatic about this. He ends up giving her his first edition Keats book, to which she replies, an old book, and tosses it on the sofa. And obviously the Freddy's files, are still in Alan's hand under the table. So Frasier says that he will give Dr. Stathos a therapy session, which she's very excited about, and he sits her so her back is to the desk, her back is to Alan, and tells her to close her eyes. And this is very well written because he's able to talk to her while also talking to Alan. And it was very well done. I rather enjoyed that. From that point on, I thought it was a really enjoyable scene, and we see Alan causing a lot of chaos in the background, and Dr. Stathos was talking really loudly, I think largely because she was really excited, but it also helped to mask any of the noise that Alan might have been making. And then, in the matter of seconds, the punch bag swung loose. That's the bit where my hand went in front of my mouth because it was very dramatic and I didn't expect it. Sparky is loose from his crate, which I love. I think Sparky is absolutely adorable. And I couldn't believe they got away with it. Alan managed to put the file back in the cabinet and get out while the punch bag was still swinging, and Sparky was loose, but he went over to Frasier and managed to leave the room while Dr. Stathos still had her eyes closed, very loudly reconnecting with her childhood. And it was just chaotic and very well done, a very, very well executed scene. What I also realised about this is that we get to see Frasier as a psychiatrist. Obviously, in the original series, we see this in pretty much every episode where he's at KSEL. I'm sure there are some episodes where we don't get to see him doing any work with anybody, but it's not something we get a lot of in this particular series or in this show, and I was rather pleased about that. And then we end with Frasier coming over to Eve's with dinner, and Freddy and Eve are supporting each other, and it's really lovely, and David his face falls onto the table because of the video game, and it was a really sweet way to end things. The final scene is actually Dr. Stathos down at the fire station taking money from people. They've clearly been playing basketball for money. I didn't care for it. I didn't care for that scene at all. But in general, I thought this was a really good episode. Definitely not my favourite. I don't think it was as funny as a lot of episodes have been, but I still really enjoyed it. Personal highlights, I think would definitely have to be when the punch bag swung loose, and just from that point on how that scene went, it was just beautifully executed. Really thoroughly enjoyed it. And of course Freddy telling Frasier, "Dad, get away from the piano," when he excitedly bounded over to it to play from HMS Pinafore. And I rather liked it. A good episode, not my favourite, but still with some really strong moments, a lot of really beneficial scenes, and ultimately The dedication is not bad at all.